You may not be on.
I'm not good with buttons. You know, that was a problem when I was flying too.
In 2022, after several attempts to develop a new spacesuit internally, NASA awarded a task order to Collins Aerospace to develop a new suit for LEO EVAs.
And while the design may be old, our team is really good at keeping those suits working.
The Wild West of space research, floating childbirth in space.
And we try to
That's
do
a
our
good
best,
answer, by the way.
right?
It's my understanding that there is currently research being done on the ISS on cancer immunotherapy.
How does NASA determine the value of bartered goods? Mr. Stallmer, thank you for being one of the young folks here too, okay? Well, let me introduce our witnesses. Our first witness today is Mr. Kenneth Bowersox, who brings a unique perspective to today's discussion. As a former NASA astronaut who spent 5.5 months aboard the ISS, Mr. Bowersox currently serves as the Associate Administrator for NASA's Space Operations Mission Directorate. Our next witness is Dr. Mary Lynne Dittmar, the Chief Government and External Relations Officer at Axiom Space. Our third witness is Dr. Robert Ferl, who co-chairs the National Academy's Decadal Survey on Biological and Physical Sciences Research in Space for 2023 to 2032. You may not be on.
Yeah. I'm not good with buttons. You know, that was a problem when I was flying too.
Mr. Bowersox, the spacesuits worn by NASA astronauts when performing ISS extravehicular activities, or EVAs, as you're well aware, are more than 40 years old and are in dire need of replacement. In 2022, after several attempts to develop a new spacesuit internally, NASA awarded a task order to Collins Aerospace to develop a new suit for LEO EVAs. NASA also awarded a task order to Axiom Space to develop a new suit for lunar EVAs. In 2023, NASA awarded a second task order to Axiom Space to develop a LEO version of Axiom's lunar spacesuit. How is NASA prioritizing the development of the LEO spacesuits versus the lunar spacesuits?
So our current spacesuits, I just want to emphasize they're working very well. And while the design may be old, our team is really good at keeping those suits working, and we're happy with how they're performing. We could always do better, but we really understand that suit well, and our team does a good job with it. The new suits that we're working, there's a lot of overlap between what you would need for a lunar suit and what you would need for a suit in low Earth orbit. That's why we have two providers. That's why it's possible for either provider to provide some part of some aspect of service for either the moon or low Earth orbit. And we're working hard with those providers to try and get a capability on ISS for the last few years of its life.
How will NASA transition from the older spacesuits to the newer models? And what are the agency's contingency plans if a new problem occurs?
Well, one of the most important things for the new suits is that it fits a wide range of astronauts, and that we can have a good suit that works for every member of the astronaut corps, whether they're small or tall, that they'll be able to work in that suit. Our current suit, it works a little bit better if you're taller and you have longer arms, but our smaller people like me do a pretty good job in it too. But we don't want to have that problem with the new suits, so we're spending a lot of time thinking about that.
Can you explain why that money was not instead used to fund the deorbit vehicle? And I have a couple of additions to that. If you just answer that one, please.
Yes, sir. You know, in order for us to manage the pace of transition with ISS to the new commercial partners, we need multiple things. We need to have those new stations, we need to have the U.S. deorbit vehicle, and we need to have good utilization on ISS. So that we maintain our transportation and utilization capability. We thought that the best use of that money was to continue effort on the commercial LEO platforms.
Are we on target with respect to technology and time to meet the demands as we look beyond the ISS mission?
First, I want to thank you for mentioning Janice. I think the world of that person. I can remember when she certified me to operate the arm on the Space Shuttle and International Space Station, and I miss her. But for our future astronauts, we want to make sure that all of our people will be able to use the new suits, that they'll fit everyone, that everybody will have good function. We also want to make sure that they're affordable. So we're looking at trying to increase the reliability and reduce the cost of the technology that we use. And we're seeing great progress with our partners.
Can you elaborate on how your biological and physical science research and those of your colleagues will help enable human exploration to the moon and then beyond to Mars?
Thank you very much for the question. It's an enjoyable thing to think about, because how we get there, how we enable ourselves to get there, and how we can do it in a way that is both doable and sustainable is key to our ability to do it, and also a key point in our decadal survey. We've recommended, in fact, 2 large-scale campaigns in this area of science that deal with the following kinds of science. How do we take an ecology with us, our microbes, our plants, and our other organisms, to sustain ourselves over the long term in wherever it is we decide to go? How do we create a mini Earth, one that doesn't need resupply? That's a big body of science that has to do with creating long-term sustainability in space. Another campaign that we've recommended is called Matrices, but it's basically the same idea. How do we change our manufacturing concepts and the science behind our manufacturing so that we can reuse what we take with us the first time, repurpose that into something else for the second time, and the third time, and the fourth, and the fifth. Moreover, when we do get to the moon, how do we manage the uptake of resources there in a way that services us as humans inside the habitats that we will build? So our science underpins all of those concepts with regard to sustainability, in addition to the plain biological questions of what happens when you take a terrestrial organism off the surface of the Earth.
Are the facilities at Kennedy Space Center sufficient to meet NASA and contractor requirements for commercial space station payload processing?
We would like to see improvement in those facilities. We'd like to see improvement in the capacity for all of the work at the Kennedy Space Center. One of the challenges we have is how we get the resources to do that. And something that I think has been talked about is potential legislative changes that would allow us to take resource investments from private partners, commercial partners, and bring them in and use them at a place like the Kennedy Space Center.
Okay. Is there any current plan to use foreign launch or payload processing facilities to service commercial space contractors?
Right now, we're not thinking about using commercial launch for that. We want to use our own activities. We might do some sort of an exchange with commercial partners in other countries where they provide a launch for us, we provide a launch for them. We could see something like that in the future, but right now we don't have anything concrete.
How is the concept of letting the contractors participate in the development of facilities? How's that? At what stage is that now?
I think it's in the stage where we're seeing a need, and I think we're talking about the potential for legislative change. And for the record, I'll go back and see exactly where we are with that proposal. But it would be very helpful if we could get contributions like that.
Could you further explain your statement about China partnering with the United Nations to select and operate international payloads?
In 2019, China and UN COPIUS announced an agreement to select payloads to fly on Chang'e. They selected initially 9 payloads, but had opportunity in that program to select others. The stated goal of that was to essentially do global outreach and involve payload developers and scientists who had not previously had the opportunity to fly, or who the China was particularly interested in bringing on board to the to Chang'e.
The intellectual property risk is real. This is one of the arguments we're making to nations who might see China as a good deal because they're deeply discounting their access. And of course, that comes at a price, and the price is they're not going to control their IP. So with respect to Starlab, we take that extremely seriously. There'll be no Chinese activity on our space station.
I read a very interesting article called The Wild West of Space Research that was in Aerospace America. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put this article into the record, Mr. Chairman. But the CEO of a spaceborne United that's in the Netherlands has stated that he wants to enable human conception in space and wants to grow human embryos off Earth. His quote is, "The long-term goal is to enable the full cycle of 9 months floating childbirth in space."
I had the honor to participate at the National Academies of Science on the Executive Committee of the Space Studies Board for many years. And the discussion about ethical constraint might be the right word, or consideration. I'm not sure exactly what the right word is. I would use things like thoughtful consideration, responsible behavior, if they were my words, has certainly been one that's been inherent in scientific pursuits for generations and generations. Certainly no different on orbit. I will say that what we've done at Axiom is our chief scientist, Lucy Lowe, who came to us from NIH, participated in a multi-author paper recently that was published in Science that addressed exactly these concerns.
Thank you. Mr. Taylor, I don't want to go over my time, but I would like to hear from all the witnesses.
Sure, I'll be brief. Thank you for the very thoughtful question. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, we're doing missions on the ISS today. We've ran 1,300 missions, our company has, on the ISS. So we anticipate in our business plan essentially abiding by the guidelines that we've abided by thus far. We're not anticipating any exotic research that we haven't already experienced. Second is we're going to be integrating our payloads, as I mentioned earlier, in the George Washington Carver Science Park, which we're putting in Ohio. Right. So it'll be subject to U.S. law and regulation. And then lastly, we're going to follow all NASA requirements.
I know for the research that we fund on the government side, we would expect to follow.
No, I understand that, but
all the
what
same
about
ethics.
What about the private sector?
On the private sector, we want to give them some freedom, right? I would expect the government to have a large say in what they do, a large influence in what they do, but we would try to give them freedom to do as much as they can. But if something just really exceeded what we thought were the boundaries of our ethical standards, then we would have a long talk.
Well, Dr. Ferl, I mean, obviously, having growing an embryo for 9 months in space does create and pose some ethical questions. I mean, what are we going to do about this?
I think that the bigger, from my perspective, the scientific question actually has been asked and answered. Can terrestrial organisms develop in the way that they are normally developing on Earth in space? Asked and answered. Yes, we can. Yes, they can.
In other words, how are commercial providers held accountable for performance?
Well, I think the questions you're asking here and that I expect in the future will be a big part of holding everybody accountable. Watching our schedules, watching how we perform on cost. I think that'll be very important in keeping all of our partners accountable and responsible for the investment we make in their developments.
How is NASA held accountable for managing program costs, schedules, and performance? Because what NASA does determines their ability to utilize the asset. Any comment on that, Dr. or Mr. Bowersox? Or anyone else?
Well, I'd say you guys do a pretty good job of holding us accountable, and we appreciate that. It's important, and we try to
That's
do
a
our
good
best.
answer, by the way.
Right? But I'll also say that, you know, we don't want to be driven completely by schedule. We want to think about whether or not we're really ready, whether the platforms are safe, and that we'll have a good platform to operate. So we're also looking at that performance.
Bowersox, how is NASA ensuring that CLDS will be ready before 2030 to prevent this?
Well, the biggest thing we're doing is trying to set up new contracts, new procurements, and trying to work to get resources so that we can develop those new platforms along with commercial partners. Of course, with the constrained resource environment that we are expecting in the future, that may be difficult. It may be difficult to maintain the utilization on the ISS, prepare the U.S. deorbit vehicle, and to prepare the commercial platforms with constraints that could be ahead of us.
With the RFP deadline just passing a couple of days ago, how can NASA centers like Marshall, with rich expertise in advanced space transportation systems, work with commercial space companies to safely deorbit the ISS? And that's to any of you that'd like to answer them.
Well, I'd love to take that question. You know, Marshall has a great history and a wonderful depth of expertise there. We use them in all of our programs to advise and monitor the work of commercial partners, all of our commercial programs, and I would expect something similar in the work with the U.S. deorbit vehicle provider.
I wanted to say, in your testimony, you had said how you discussed an American presence in low Earth orbit is under the threat, and how the likelihood of a gap, this is what I'm worried about, in LEO following the decommissioning of the ISS has never been greater. What concerns do you have with the proposed mission authorization system by the Biden administration specifically, and how could it disrupt the plans by NASA to shift from the International Space Station to commercial stations by the end of the decade?
Thank you for the question, Dr. McCormick. We are very concerned about the proposal. We are concerned about its bifurcated nature, with some of the aspects of what would be happening on orbit being handled by one federal agency and then other aspects being handled by another federal agency. We think that there is a great deal of room for communication difficulty between the agencies. There's an interagency process that is sort of called for by the proposal that would require collaboration and discussion. We're concerned about delays that might be imposed by that. We think that there's basically a lot of questions to be answered. The devil is in the details, so to speak. Regulatory frameworks need to be streamlined as much as possible. Nobody argues with the need for regulation. As was mentioned before, I'm sitting here as the industry co-chair of the FAA Space Advisory Rulemaking Committee right now for commercial human spaceflight occupant safety. I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't think it was a worthwhile effort. However, we do have a great deal of concern with the structure of the proposal.
What are the benefits and advantages of space stations that are commercial space stations as part of this solution? Okay, we understand there'd be a scientific advantage to having those, but what else would it be able? How would that benefit us in the sort of the decommissioning of the current ISS?
Well, so we've got commitment from our Russian partners to go through 2028. And the rest of the ISS partners are working towards 2030 as the last date for full utilization. And then ISS deorbit would start after that point. We expect that our Russian partners will work to see what they can do after 2028. They have some technical concerns. They also have some budget concerns. A lot of the reason that they haven't extended past 2028 is just the way their budget system works. We have a really good technical relationship with our Russian partners, and we're looking forward to hearing from them that they're ready to stay with us through 2030. That's very important.
I'm just jump in really quickly here. I will say Axiom and Voyager, and I'm sure, are working very diligently to make certain that we have capabilities on orbit prior to the end of ISS decommissioning. I mean, prior to the end of life. I would just point out that things happen. Between when we made our proposal and were granted our award, okay, and then started to actually bend metal on our station, there was a pandemic. And then there were vendor and supply issues, which the entire aerospace and defense sector are still trying to deal with. So although we're working very diligently and believe that we'll be able to do this, there is a tremendous budget crunch coming. And Congress needs to step up, in my opinion, okay, and basically make sure that we are on a path to ensure that there is no gap in low Earth orbit.
Specifically the research being done on the ISS that has medical applications back here at home. It's my understanding that there is currently research being done on the ISS on cancer immunotherapy, and a drug specifically that, if applied back to Earth, would allow a patient to get a shot in a doctor's office versus being attached to an IV in a hospital. As you can imagine, this could prove to be a game changer for patients like the ones I see in clinic, and this really drives home how important it is for Americans that we continue to to do research at the ISS and beyond. So for Mr. Bowersox, sometimes the importance of the research that happens in space, I think, gets lost in translation between the federal government and our constituents. So what is NASA doing to help emphasize its importance with the public, and how can Congress help?
Well, first of all, we try to talk about the research and the work being done at ISS every chance we get. But the one thing I would encourage you and the rest of the members of the panel and the folks listening is to go to the ISS Benefits for Humanity. Just do that on an internet search engine, go to that website, and you'll be amazed at all the information there and all that you can learn about the work that's going on International Space Station.
Can you explain to the committee how NASA negotiates these barter agreements with international partners? How does NASA determine the value of bartered goods and services? For instance, how can the taxpayer trace whether certain components, like Russian Progress vehicles, have already been accounted for in an earlier deal? Who would like to answer that? Mr. Bowersox?
And because that's a very detailed question, it's probably best that I take it for the record and get something substantial back to you. But our folks are very careful in the ISS program, trying to make sure that we get very good value for what we invest, and that we see similar investments from our partners. You know, we're very careful about it. It is one of those areas where sometimes there's give and take, right? We know that one of our partners needs something, we'll make sure that they get that. They know we need something, and they make sure that we get it, right? So there is a little bit of fuzziness there. I don't want to say it's always a perfect exchange.
I want to go back to, there was an event that happened this past Sunday. You may have heard of it. It was a sports game that had a concert in the middle of it, okay? I think people need to understand that what we're talking about here with the International Space Station would barely fit between the goalposts of a football field. So, Mr. Bowersox, could you help us visualize in our head, because this is something that's never happened before, how we decommission the International Space Station? How do we make sure that the people on Earth are safe? How do we keep something so massive away from the things that are in low Earth orbit that we rely upon every day?
So our number one strategy right now for keeping the ISS flying and minimizing any chance of an uncontrolled entry is to keep it in the best shape we can, taking care of every maintenance item as it needs to be taken care of, and maximizing the redundancy everywhere we can across the station. If it were to come down in an uncontrolled fashion, there would be large pieces of the International Space Station coming down somewhere between its northern orbit limit and its southern orbit limit in a part of the world we don't know, and there would be a large risk to the population on the surface of the Earth.
Could you explain to us how we need to develop the piece of machinery that is going to help us bring this down?
So what we've got in mind is the U.S. deorbit vehicle. What it does is basically it'll go up there, it'll wait 6 months or a year, and then gradually the ISS will start to come down lower towards the Earth just because of the high levels of the atmosphere causing drag on the space station. And then as it gets down to its final altitude, we'll do an impulse from that deorbit vehicle, and that will cause the ISS to come down in a much smaller area of the Indian Ocean is likely where we would target it, out as far as we can from landmass and as far away from people as we can get it. And that greatly lowers the risk to people on the surface of the Earth to our goal of 1 in 10,000, below 1 in 10,000 risk to anybody on the surface.
And I was going to mention them earlier, but most of them have left. But we have had literally dozens of young student-age young adults that have been coming in and out during this entire hearing. And when I was prepared to make that announcement, right before I did, they all left. So there's still some young people in here. Mr. Stallmer, thank you for being one of the young folks here too, okay? We really appreciate everybody that's come here today, and really want to say thank you to our witnesses here in a very fascinating hearing, which has given us some valuable information. So with that, this hearing is adjourned.